And welcome back to History and Politics chat at 4 o'clock on Tuesday. Today, obviously, when I'm going to be answering some of your questions. Not all of them, unfortunately, but at least some of them to maybe give you some grounding for where we are in the news. But can I just start by saying, isn't it great not to have a bombardment of news coming at you all the time? I mean, I have actually, if you noticed, I've actually written my nightly letter before 2 o'clock. I think every night this week, not last week, but so far this week, I've been in bed before 2 o'clock every night, and I think last night I was in bed before midnight or close to it anyway. Really, it's kind of like the way life used to be. Remember? Anyway, so I have a bunch of things I wanted to talk about today. First of all, actually, I'm going to turn on this light over here. First of all, uh, one of the things that's really striking to me when you write and ask me questions is the tone of the way the things that people are asking. And I want to point something out to you all, and that is that as you are asking me questions, and you guys can look over these as well, many people are almost holding back and saying, "What's going to happen when someone does this? What's going to happen when someone does this?" And there is a sense that you are sitting back waiting for the future to happen to you. And if there is anything that the last 4 years have taught us, it's that we, the people, must determine the future. So I'm going to answer your questions, and I'm going to maybe make some suggestions to things you can do to change the future. But that being said, take back your power. You know, this is our country, and we get to decide what we want to have happen to it going forward. And that's one of the things I think that has made this last election such a surprise in so many ways to so many people, is because a lot of people who in the past had not really spoken up and tried to determine the future did. And when they did, they created something entirely new. So one of the things that I'm seeing again and again is people saying, "Oh, you know, the neo-Nazis haven't gone away, and what are we going to do?" Of course they haven't. But they don't have to determine the future. We have proven that there are more people who object to that future of America than who adhere to it. In this last election, as you know, Joe Biden won at this point by more than 6 million votes. And I know that doesn't count because of the Electoral College, but it does matter in terms of the way people think about America. And that number, I think, is really interesting when you think about the fact that really the Trump administration quite deliberately tried to depress Democratic votes. If it had been a free and fair vote, and this is one of the things I've said all along, people said to me, "Who's going to win this next election?" This was before the November election, and I would say, in a free and fair vote, the Democrats are going to win, because they have been winning now for many, many years. But the problem is that votes have not been free and fair, and the fact that the Democrats, nonetheless, despite that fact, managed to go ahead and put their president in office, or at least put him in line to get into office in January of 2021, is really significant in terms of the direction the country is going. And as I've said to you, I study the way people talk about things and the way things look, and how they have compare them to how they look in the past. And our national conversation has been very different. Now, that national conversation is not going to stay different if all the people who have been speaking up for the last 4 years think the deal is done because they're guys in the White House. That's the absolute worst case scenario, and I'll explain to you why that will be the case. But the job is not over. The job has only begun. But here's the good news. The good news is that that this is the fun part. This is the creating part. And yes, it's frustrating. And yes, believe me, I'm a writer. I know this. And things aren't going to go the way you want, and it's never going to be exactly what you want. But what a wonderful opportunity to go create something. And that's a very different thing than sort of trying to stop people from destroying something. A very big difference between trying to stop someone from smashing a sculpture versus going ahead and creating your own sculpture. And we are now at the point where the smashing has stopped, and we get to do the creating part. And that's the fun part. It's the hard part. And there's a lot of criticism involved, which people find hard to take. But it is the exciting part. So let me get ahead here to your questions. And I'm going to do what I've been doing in the letters, and that is that I'm going to try and contain the Trump administration to the first half of what I'm going to say, because we can't ignore the fact that Donald Trump is still in the White House and still the president of the United States until noon of January 20th, I think the day is. Of next year. So he is still the president. And I know a lot of people are saying, I'm so tired of listening to anything about Trump. Believe me, I agree. But he is the president. And what he's doing still speaks for America. And that's maybe a problem. So what I'm going to try and do is answer some of your questions about Trump, and then go on to your questions about Biden and the history of the Republican Party, which people continue to ask me about, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So first of all, people have asked whether or not Trump can be pardoned, whether he can pardon other people, whether the Senate can pardon him, all sorts of questions like that. The president is the only person who has the power to pardon, and the president can only pardon for federal crimes. So here's the chess calculation going. So somebody asked if the Senate can pardon Trump. No, the Senate does not have the power to pardon anybody. It's kind of interesting, actually, all the different things that people have. So, senators can't be impeached. They can be expelled, but it takes 2/3 of the Senate to do that. They have all these different rules. And I can tell you more about Senate rules if you want me to get back into why McConnell is so powerful. But so the president can pardon for federal crimes, and people have said, but wait a minute, if somebody hasn't been charged with a crime yet, can the president then pardon them for that? And the answer to that, at least historically, is yes. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Milhous Nixon for anything he might have done. Nixon had not been indicted in any crimes. Lots of people had been, but Nixon was not one of them, nor, by the way, had Nixon been formally impeached. Nixon had been, the articles of impeachment had been voted on by the Judiciary Committee of the House, and they had passed them. And it was clear that the House as a whole would impeach Nixon. And the issue there was the same one that Donald Trump faced. Would the Senate then convict? And the senators, including Barry Goldwater, went to and I believe George H.W. Bush as well, because he was the chair of the Republican National Committee at that point. You can check me on that one. Don't quote me on that one. But certainly Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona who had been the Republican nominee for president in 1964, they went to the White House and they said, Nixon, you're done. They didn't call him that. I assume they called him Dick, but they said, which was his nickname, but they said, the House is going to vote to impeach you and the Senate will convict. So you will be convicted of impeachment, resign and get out ahead of this. And Nixon did. He felt like he didn't have a choice. That being said, he never admitted guilt. And the reason that he never admitted guilt, and if you read his memoirs, he has this paragraph when he talks about this, and he says, I didn't do anything wrong. He says that he was hounded out of office because the liberal media, which I've talked about here before, wouldn't permit him to do his job. So he never admits guilt. And later on in a series of interviews with the journalist David Frost, he says, listen, when the president does something, that means it's not illegal. And people have looked at that and said, oh, this is the imperial presidency. There's even books entitled that. And that is a really dangerous way for America to go. And there's some unfortunate parallels between that concept and the concept I've talked about before here of the unitary executive. And that has an intellectual history behind it in which they say, well, if the three branches of government are equal, the executive branch, the legislative branch, which is Congress, and the judicial branch. Therefore, the head of the executive branch cannot be checked by the other two, because that would mean that they are no longer equal. That to me is a real stretch. If you read the Constitution very clearly, the idea is that the president will be vulnerable to the idea of impeachment if he or she doesn't. Of course, in those days, you're not thinking about a she, if he is not performing his duties in the way that the Congress people thought was appropriate. And not on political grounds, but rather in terms of upholding the laws and executing the laws, which is, after all, what the executive is supposed to do. All right, so the president can pardon, but only for federal crimes, including for crimes that have not yet been charged, according to the pardon that Ford gives to Nixon. So yes, theoretically, Trump can pardon people for crimes that have not yet been out, that have not come out in the open. But there's some caveats to that, some warnings to that. And that is that generally, and again, these are all legal questions as opposed to historical questions. So a lot of them are arguable, just so you know. And, you know, if you have a good enough lawyer, you can argue almost anything. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That helps our legislation move forward and our understandings of law move forward. So I'm going to say some things that somebody could argue with. So, for example, there is an understanding among, I would say, a majority of lawyers that if you have accepted a pardon, you have lost your right to take the Fifth Amendment, because the whole Fifth Amendment to the Constitution prohibits, enables you to testify, to say you're not going to testify because it can incriminate you. But if you've gotten a pardon so you can't be punished for a crime, that takes away the Fifth Amendment. So there are examples where the president has not, and I believe Roger Stone is one, has not actually given a pardon, but rather has commuted a sentence, because that doesn't take away the criminality, the pardon for the criminality. So that protects someone's right to the Fifth. So Trump does run the problem of that if he pardons people, that might take away their ability not to testify against him. So there's another problem, and that is that he can't pardon himself. I know that there have been rumors that he has been trying to argue that he can pardon himself. I personally do not think that would hold up in any court, including his handpicked courts, because that just absolutely flies in the face of everything that the Constitution was set out to do. So that's really dubious ground. I know people have made the argument he could. I think that would be a really hard sell. So that leaves the issue that people are talking about. Could he resign, step down, and have Mike Pence step into his place and pardon him? So they could do a back scratching thing here. Yes, technically that could happen. But again, you always got to look down the road here. What's in that for Mike Pence? So I think the pardon question is really a little bit murkier than people think. I am expecting there to be blanket pardons coming, but I could see very good reasons why there may not be. So I can't give you the definitive answer on that, but that's what a pardon does. Now, people have asked, what about the Southern District of New York and the other places in which Trump is in trouble with the law? Can a pardon do anything about those? And the answer is no. The federal government, the president cannot pardon for a state crime. There was a move afoot to make it possible for Trump to do that early on, and that went nowhere. So the expectation is, and as you know, if you've been listening to me, there was a memo in the Department of Justice in 1973 that said a sitting president could not be indicted for crimes, with the idea that that would waste a president's time, that he'd be stuck all the time defending himself in court, so it would not be a service to the nation for that to happen. So that memo, which is not a law, which has never been tested in court, is one of the reasons, for example, that Robert Mueller took off because he was operating under the Department of Justice, never considered whether or not Trump was criminally implicated in anything he studied, because he couldn't. That was that was off the table from the start. And so the expectation is that, and as I've said here before as well, the Trump administration has tried to argue that not only can Trump not be implicated while he's in office, he also can't be investigated, which is why they have refused to answer subpoenas and why they have refused to answer Congress or anything. They've said that the executive president, the under the unitary executive, that nobody can even investigate him, which again seems to me a real long shot. But what this means is that the minute he is no longer president at 12:01 on January 20th, the states can absolutely indict him and the Trump organization and anybody else they want to. And that's not to say he's going to be guilty, but they certainly can bring forward the cases that we know are there simply because of the financial shenanigans that appear to have gone on. And of course, he's also responsible for his financial behavior in Scotland, where the Tunbury Golf Course has had some very funny financial dealings over the last number of years. And that I'm not a forensic accountant, but I will tell you, I have worked with forensic accountants, and they're brilliant. I wish I mean, talk about fun, to chase down the numbers to be able to do all that. And perhaps one final note on that, and that is that, why does all this matter in terms of the Southern District of New York? And by the way, Southern District of New York is so important because that's where Manhattan is, and that's where all financial transactions take place. So the Southern District of New York has, you're sort of like, why would it be New York? Why wouldn't it be Florida? Where it might be those places as well, but the Southern District of New York handles financial stuff. And of course, because the Trump organization is there in Manhattan, that's going to be handling all their financials and their financial issues. And the reason for that, the reason that people are so interested in the cases that might be coming before the Southern District is because, they got Al Capone on charges of tax evasion, and people kind of roll their eyes and they say, that's stupid. It was Al Capone. They should have gotten him on all the many things they could have gotten him on. But the thing about financial crimes is that there's a record. You have to file paperwork. And so there's numbers, and you can go in front of a judge and you can say, here's a set of numbers and here's a set of numbers, and they don't match or whatever. Whereas if it's a crime of intent, how do you prove someone's intent? Now, obviously lawyers do it, but anybody who's smart and operating in shady ways is not going to write down on a sheet of paper, today I felt like I wanted to go kill someone, or whatever. They're not going to put that down. Whereas the financial crimes are there in black and white, and it's much easier to get someone on that. And I have to say, just as an aside here, one of my favorite historical stories is actually of the Johnson County War of 1892 in Wyoming, where literally some large cattle ranchers were trying to get rid of the smaller cattle ranchers in their area, and they called them rustlers, and they said they were criminals and all that, but basically they wanted their land, and they literally hired 50 gunmen from Texas to come up and kill the small ranchers, and they literally gave them a hit list of people to kill. And I always tell my students, I hope you guys don't go on to become criminals, but if you do, don't give someone a handwritten list of all the people that you're intending to kill, because that doesn't look real good in court. And yet, actually, now that I say that, the joke's on me, because of course all those guys walked because they basically owned the government. All right, so another question people have asked about Trump is, can he go to jail? Sure, he can go to jail. Is he going to go to jail? No. I mean, I really don't think so, for this reason. The man is 74, apparently not in terribly good health, either physically or mentally. And again, a good set of lawyers can drag stuff out for a very long time. And my guess is they will simply drag any cases in which he is involved out long enough that that even if he stays in this country, and I think that might be a long shot, I don't ever expect to see him in jail personally. Now, his children are a really different story, but that's not what you asked about. All right, so a couple of things here along this. Let me give you an easy one. Somebody asked about the reassignment of districts for the Supreme Court. Is that unusual, or was that nefarious? Every time there's a reworking of the Supreme Court, they reassign areas, so regions. So that's not it. From everything I understand, that's a normal reworking, and it certainly looks nefarious in the sense that so many of the people that Trump appointed are now in key areas, but they were going to be in some key areas anyway. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to that if there was going to be anything big coming up about this election, it was going to go in front of more than one justice anyway. So I think that was pretty much routine. Now, maybe somebody's laughing at me somewhere for thinking it was routine, but you'll notice I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. Sometimes sometimes things just happen, because they got to happen. So that was not one I worried about. All right. People are asking about what on earth is the Republican Party doing going along with Trump right now, when he's clearly, at this point, I started out by saying he was spinning a narrative. And now it's beyond a narrative. Now it's kind of crazy. Not that it was ever reasonable, but the idea that he won an election where at this point the electors have been certified and the numbers are big, and Biden's won way more states than he needs, and the number. For Trump insisting now to say, Yeah, we're going to go ahead and tell the Emily Murphy at the General Services Administration that she can release the funds, and that we're going to go ahead and start communicating in very limited ways, by the way, with the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration. But I don't concede. And that, so what's going on with that? First of all, what Trump is doing is, to me, it makes complete sense. And I'm going to put it my way, and then I'm going to tell you what my son just told me. And what my way is, he's a narcissist. He must have control of the headlines. So what are his options? If he concedes the election and says, you're right, I lost, no one's ever going to pay any attention to him again. So in order to keep getting attention, and also to take people's eyes off some of the other stuff he's doing that I'm going to mention in a second, he's got to keep escalating. So it only makes sense for him to do that. I don't frankly see, with that kind of a personality, what else you do. I mean, unless you God forbid, start a war, or suddenly, give all your fortune to charity and run away to live on a mountaintop in Nepal, in which case you wouldn't be able to read the newspapers. And yes, I'm being ridiculous here. I don't see what he can do except continue to escalate. A personality like that, it's not that he won't stop, it's that he can't stop. So that's what my take on it is. It's his personality. He is doing it because there's nothing else for him to do. And of course, there's he would like to continue to be president because he doesn't want to have to deal with all these lawsuits, and he likes the attention. But my son put it a different way just now. I just got back from a walk with him, and he said, and I was saying to him, what do you think is going on with coronavirus? I mean, could they have made it any worse? Like, literally, if the administration was working for a different country, could they have made it any worse? And he said that he thought I didn't understand. He's 30 years younger than me, and he watches TV, and I do not. And he said, you don't watch reality TV. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, I do. And I will tell you that this is the plot of reality TV, that every time something happens, you escalate. So the same way I read once, I mean, this is me saying it, not him, that the way improv theater works is that you can't ever say no. That every time the person that you're doing improv with escalates a situation, you have to say yes. So it gets more and more ridiculous and funnier to everybody. And my son said that the same thing is true of reality TV, except it's not supposed to be escalating for fun. It's supposed to be escalating for anger and drama. And he said to me, it only makes sense that once he had said we're going to open up the transition, that the next stage was to say, but I don't concede. And he said, we should, I don't know, so I'm sure some of you people watch reality TV. I don't, but if you do, maybe this makes sense to you. And because it does always create drama. And he was saying that on one of the shows that he doesn't, I make him sound like he watches TV all the time. He doesn't, but one of the shows he was watching, he said, literally, this family got into this giant fight over whether or not somebody had made a bed. And he said, part of it is the ridiculousness of it. Who cares whether or not somebody had made a bed? But it becomes this, incredibly escalating drama where you sit there on your couch going, oh, no, they wouldn't do that. And then, of course, they do that. And he said that kind of mentality is, he thinks, what has shaped Donald Trump's career, and that's really all he's got. So there's two reasons why he might be acting the way he is. But the question that people have asked is, why is the Republican Party in general doing so? Is it a reflection on the upcoming Georgia elections? And let me explain that for just a second. So each state, as you know, has its own rules about elections. And that came from the history of the different states. And actually, the states really are quite different on the way they handle elections, and they're more similar now than they were in the 19th century. But what that means is that they all have their own rules and regulations. And in Georgia, if no candidate for Senate gets above 50%, they have to have a runoff. So the Georgia vote, which was a really interesting vote this year, Georgia has had issues with voter suppression. And I'm not going to make any accusations this time around, but their history of voter suppression is one that is and should be continued to be studied. And in that election, neither of the Republican candidates got over 50%. So both of them are going to a runoff. And what that means is that the Republican candidates, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, are going up against, in order, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. I think his name's Raphael. I just think of Reverend. He's the minister of Martin Luther King Jr.'s former Church of Emmanuel. And they are in these runoffs. And Georgia now went for the first time in a long time, and I'm not going to say the date because I'm not positive about that. My guess is Jimmy Carter, but went for a Democratic candidate. So what had seemed to be a tightly red state is now weird. And this means that the Republicans don't really know what to do about Georgia. Do they? And they've got a problem because elections that have major names at the top of the ticket, so a presidential election, is going to get a lot more people out, or a different set of people out, that are going to show up for a Senate race. So the question is, how are you going to motivate Republicans to show up to vote for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue when in fact both of them are under ethics investigations and both of them did not show well in the run up to the November election? Do you go ahead and encourage Trump to kind of stir the pot so his voters feel like getting out, or do you back away from him and hope that that what that'll mean is that the Democrats won't show up out of anger against Trump? So they're kind of in a funny place where to be. And the understanding, at least early on, was that it would be a good thing for Georgia for Trump to stay in the race and for him to rile people up in Georgia so that they would show up and vote for the Republicans in that Senate race. And we actually have quotations from certain people, and I'm not going to say which they are because I'm afraid I'll say the wrong ones, but from senators who said, yeah, we're here because we know that it's going to help us in Georgia. But then Trump has gone further and further to extremes, trying to take this election to the point that it really is undemocratic. And there have been more and more people sort of stepping up and going, not only do you look like a sore loser, you also are attacking our fundamental institutions. And then a couple, I've forgotten how many days now, the woman who had been his top lawyer, Sidney Powell, actually went out in public and said that Loeffler, that the votes in Georgia that Trump was trying to get at that point, they've since been certified, but Georgia had been so corrupt that Kelly Loeffler had gotten the votes she had gotten illegally, or that they had not been real votes for her. And all of a sudden, the people in Georgia are like, hey, wait a minute here. You're not helping on this front. And you'll notice within a day between that and some other stuff she'd said, the Trump administration came out and says, we have nothing to do with Sidney Powell, which was crazy because she'd been out there in front of the whole recount effort in a number of places. So right now, in terms of why the Republicans were hanging on to Trump, that's a really good question, because I think that they had been doing it because of Georgia and because they didn't want to anger Trump voters in their own states. So it just seemed easier to wait and follow the president's lead. But now they're in this funny place where yesterday, Carl Bernstein outed 21 of them as privately saying, the guy's a loser, we got to make this stop, but they haven't come out and said it, so then they look weak. And now they're in this funny place where they like the policies that Trump has put forward, but they also recognize that he's a time bomb right now, and that makes them very nervous because they want to stop him, but they don't want to hurt his vote. They don't want to push away his voters because many of them have aspirations for 2024, but even before that, they don't want to anger the people who just voted for them, because remember, they have all just been reelected thanks to Trump voters. So they're really kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Does this excuse them for not speaking up on the fact that he has taken this unprecedented step of attacking our elections? No, of course it doesn't excuse them. It's appalling, I think, personally, but I think that's why they are doing what they are doing, is because they don't want to make their own Trump voters unhappy, and they were in it for the Georgia vote, and now they're sort of hoping he'll go away. But as I just said a minute ago, this is one of the real problems is with him is that he won't stop. He's going to keep on escalating. Okay, so people are asking, I've seen just another question here that I hope I can work in down here. Hang on. And on to the next thing. All right, so so I said, he is doing a lot of things that they are people are concerned about, and let me start right here. The Republicans have spoken out against two things that Trump has done recently because, and let me actually go into this in a different way. People have asked a lot about the Open Skies Treaty and the fact that 6 months ago, Trump announced we would be leaving the Open Skies Treaty. And you may or may not remember, there was a huge outcry against that at the time. And now 6 months have elapsed, and he said, yeah, I did it. We're out. The Open Skies Treaty was proposed back by Eisenhower in the 50s, but it actually went into effect in 1992. And the idea is that the signatories to it, and I think there's 32 of them at this point, can send reconnaissance planes with warning. You have to give a little bit of warning because you don't want to catch somebody doing something secret, or maybe you do want to catch somebody doing something secret, but they don't want you to. It gives them enough time to get, if they're doing some secret maneuver, to get it under wraps. So after giving I don't remember how long notice it is, maybe 3 days, but maybe less than that, reconnaissance planes to the countries that are signatories can fly over each other's territories just to make sure they're not doing anything. Now, in terms of America, we have really good satellite imagery. And the argument is that we don't really need this stuff so much because we have really good satellite imagery. And but here's the kicker. All of this, once again, comes down to NATO and Russia. Because the reason that America likes the Open Skies Treaty is because it permits people to fly, countries, including us, to fly over Russia to see what Russia is doing. If you remember, Russia had sanctions slapped on it because it invaded Crimea, which is part of Ukraine. And it's still in this hot war with Ukraine. It actually advanced again last week. And I know it's kind of fallen off of our radar screens in America, but that is still very much a hot war. And by America saying we're not going to fly over Russia any longer, and they're saying, well, Russia cheated. In fact, Russia has been cheating a little bit on it, but we've been pushing back on that, and that's those are the kind of issues one has when one has a treaty with a country like that. But by pulling us out of the Open Skies Treaty, the people it hurts are the Ukrainians, because which again, that's a chess piece, if you will. Because Ukraine, if you recall, is caught between Russia on the one side and Europe on the other. And the people in Ukraine would like to join with Europe and strengthen the European alliance. And Russia wants Ukraine because it's such a valuable place. And this is why there have been so many fights over Ukraine. And this is why Paul Manafort was in there before 2016, going ahead and putting a pro-Russian oligarch into the presidency. He gets thrown out. He ends up running to Russia. And Manafort ends up out of a job. The Ukrainians end up trying to create their own new pro-democracy government and trying to realign with NATO. And so Ukraine is this puzzle piece, if you will, that's being tugged between NATO and Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other. And by us pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty, what that does is it means nobody is going to be, or we're not anyway, and are not going to be able to sit over Russia and see if they're massing troops on the edge of Ukraine. And so that's what that, I think, is really about. And it's very disturbing. The other piece that people have asked about is he is scrapping the planes instantly scrapping the planes, selling off the planes that we have used. And that's the story behind that is, first of all, those planes are very old. The technology on them is old. And a bigger deal is the fact that he refused to replace them. There were plans in the works to replace them with younger planes, and he's refused to do that. So we don't have those. But the scrapping of those planes, as I say, they should not have on them the newest technologies that actually enable people to photograph and to read better than we can now. I assume that they won't go with that, but the bigger deal is that I think the whole scrapping of equipment is a really interesting one, and it reminds me, of course, of the fact that when the United States Postal Service under Louis DeJoy went ahead and decided to change the mail system, which significantly depressed the vote in the last election. By the way, that story has not gone away. I've seen the numbers, I've read through the numbers, and it really did depress the vote in places like Detroit. That he insisted not only that new machines get taken offline, but that they be destroyed. And the answer to that is rather like spiking someone's cannons. And by the way, that means literally you would hammer a spike into the touch hole of a cannon and then bend it off so that there was really no way to get that sucker out. Somebody else couldn't use the cannon. And that, I think, is kind of what Trump is doing here, is he's guaranteeing that Biden's got no choice. He's out of that treaty, because we're not going to have the planes to go back into them if Trump has sold them off and not built any new ones. So I think that's what's going on with that. But that, of course, is not the only thing that is an issue. The Open Skies Treaty. There remains out there our withdrawal of troops all over the world now. And again, people are on record saying this is simply an attempt to box Joe Biden in by, no one's going to put those troops back in. And the removal of troops, for example, from Afghanistan is, lots of people, me included, think the whole war in Afghanistan has been insane. But the problem was, it's 19 years now, it's our longest war in American history, but the problem is that Trump did a deal with the Afghan government and the Taliban back in February, in which the Taliban was supposed to meet a number of conditions in order for America to pull out. And it hasn't done so. Meanwhile, the Afghan government has, and so it's released a number of Taliban fighters, for example. And the real concern is that if America pulls its remaining troops down the way Trump is suggesting he will, the Taliban will take back over significant parts of Afghanistan, including those that have a lot of really valuable minerals, and be able to finance terrorism from there, not only finance it, but also provide a home for international terrorists, including Al-Qaeda. So, people who, even Republicans, are looking at this going, are you kidding us? This is, we are this close to winning this, or not winning, because it's not a winning situation, but this close to having pushed the Taliban back to a place where they can be monitored and maintained. And instead, at the very last minute, as one of the leaders said, and I don't remember which one it was, I shouldn't say which one it is because I don't remember, said, we're at the 5-yard line here. And you're saying you're going to take your ball and go home and leave the field to the other side. And the fact that he is doing that is, again, a huge gift to anybody who's interested in destabilizing NATO. Because NATO, of course, depends, the North American Treaty Organization, which was put into place in the 1950s, in late 1940s, but it gets on its feet in the 50s with the Korean War, is put on its feet to stand against the USSR. And with the fall of the USSR, the militarization and the rise of Putin's Russia, it stayed in place in order to push back against Putin. And that's, Trump has destabilized that. In 4 years, he has really rocked that NATO organization. And remember, he would go to meetings and yell at people from NATO. So that is destabilizing NATO by pulling troops out all over the world, or pulling down troops all over the world. Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. Those are all places where many of us would like to see our troops out, or at the very least, whatever. I'm not going to make a military statement right now. But pulling them all out right before he leaves is simply not done, because you want to go ahead and give your successor the right to go ahead and make the decisions he wants to make. And Biden will not have that option. And a lot of Republicans are very upset about that. They are also upset about the other thing that I have written about fairly extensively, and that is the sale of between $23 and $25 billion worth of military equipment to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which the Congress on a bipartisan basis has said, do not do this, when they tried to put a stop to an $8.1 billion sale in 2018, Trump declared an emergency, and Pompeo went ahead and did it anyway. And the Congress did not have the votes to override Trump's veto. When they told him not to do it, he could veto it. But this is huge. This is at $23 billion, including, it's either 50 or 100, I've seen it both ways, of our F-35 fighter jets. And those are the most modern technology in the world, and he is selling them to the United Arab Emirates. And the real concern there is obviously the United Arab Emirates have wanted them for a long time, or since we've had them, but there's also the expectation that spies from China and Russia will be able to get this technology quite quickly. So that's another place where Trump is really boxing in Biden. And he's doing so economically as well, with a number of measures that that are going to make it hard for Biden to respond to the economic crisis, and the fact that McConnell is refusing even to put on the table another coronavirus package right here before the end of the year. It feels very much to me as if they are really trying to hand Biden a disaster. All right, so that brings me to Biden's choice, what's going on with Biden and the cabinet. A lot of people have questions about Biden's cabinet, and I have a bunch to say about that. But I want to start with concerns among progressives that Biden's cabinet is not progressive enough. And my answer to that is this is a great cabinet. And it's a great cabinet because they know what they're doing. I think Biden turned out to be a great Democratic pick for president. And somebody got upset before when I said that he was not my top choice. He wasn't everybody's top choice, but I absolutely have come around to the idea that he is an institutionalist, and what we need right now is people who can rebuild the institutions that we have lost. And the fact that he nominated Anthony Blinken straight out of the box first was an indicator to our European allies that we care deeply about the State Department, which handles our foreign affairs, and that we will be rebuilding our European alliances. So the damage that Trump did with the Open Skies Treaty, with the UAE deals, with the many, many things that he has done to weaken our ties to Europe, those are going to be as repaired as it is possible for Biden to do. And that was his reasoning or at least the implication of his nomination so quickly of Blinken first, to put that first out there rather than even the Department of Justice. So that was a major international signal to put that there. So the trick, though, is that they're all institutionalists. They're all very, very good at what they do. I had to laugh. I was reading one of their resumes, and it was not resume, it was a write-up when they first came out. And the first paragraph alone was made me think, what am I doing with my life? This person has done more in one paragraph than I've done in the last 58 years. But then there were 2 more paragraphs after that. So what he is doing is he's sending a signal that expertise matters, that he's going to use intelligence, he's going to use expertise, and he's going to use people who are invested in our public government. So a great contrast, I think, between, Rex Tillerson and Blinken, or Flournoy I believe she's at Defense, and Rex Tillerson, who's at State, is that Tillerson is no idiot. Tillerson's resume is enormously impressive. He was an engineer who worked himself up to be the head of Exxon, and you don't do that if you're a dummy. But he was not a public servant. He was not somebody who had dedicated his interests to helping America and helping the people of America. His interests had gone into the extraction of resources and money making for his shareholders. And he's not a stupid man, but his interests were not the same as actually government. And he didn't take that position willingly, and he was not a happy camper while he was there. His story is a very interesting one. But these people have all dedicated their lives to serving in government. And while some people think that's a bad thing, let me point out that all of these people are well known as being nice, decent human beings. And that matters right there as well. Now, some people are like, yeah, but I don't like Blinken's stand on, some issue or other, or Flournoy on something. What I would say about that is twofold. First of all, by definition, if your government is working correctly, it's not going to make you happy. Because the point is that even though, we would all like to be master of the universe, maybe, the whole point is compromise. We're not going to get everything we want. And an awful lot of times, people do things that look like they're crazy on the surface, but at the end of the day, it turns out it was a really good decision. And my example of that is when George H.W. Bush went into to the first Gulf War, I was horrified, horrified. I was actually living in London, and I was just, so I saw the bombs fall. It was late here. I was in like prime time there. And I was horrified. When I actually became a historian and studied why he did that and how that happened, I understood it. And I understood that that there were many options there, but that was not necessarily a stupid move, because it did send the message to strong actors as the USSR broke up, that America was not going to stand by while smaller states got swallowed up by bigger states. And that was news to me. I had to read a lot of biographies of George H.W. Bush to get to that point, but I came around on that one. So my point is that we are not always going to understand, and they're going to screw up too. Eisenhower destabilized Iran, and we paid for it in spades later on. So they are going to screw up. And I mean, I could go through every single administration and tell you, God, they screwed this one up. But the question is, are they trying to do what's right? And that's one part of it. So don't expect to like everything. But two, when people talk about outsiders, they assume somehow that people outside have new, exciting ideas. And my example of that is Rex Tillerson. He was an outsider, and a very smart outsider. But I was not happy with what that man did. The trick to being outsiders is that outsiders, to my mind, work best if they are putting pressure on insiders. And I've talked about this here before. So, if, people loved Bernie Sanders as a presidential candidate, and I, as a person who understands institutions, would look at that and say, he's not getting anything through Congress. You want to have people inside, like Joe Biden, who can get stuff through Congress. The problem with people who can get stuff through Congress, they're so important. I mean, this is why Lincoln was great. This is why LBJ was great. They got stuff through Congress. The problem with them is it's hard for them to think outside the bubble, because that's all they've been doing all their lives, is getting stuff through Congress. So the trick is that if there are things you care about as progressives or as conservatives or as whoever is looking at this here, you got to put pressure on people. You got to put pressure on those representatives, because if you can convince Joe Biden that he needs to make college free, or do wind energy, or whatever is your thing, he's going to be able to do it. But your job is to create that pressure so he feels like he has to. And that's the point that I started out with here, saying you can't let this go, because I promise you, Obama, Biden, nobody is going to do something until there is pressure from voters to make them do it. And there's a famous line from Tip O'Neill that I probably will get wrong. He was a very famous Speaker of the House, and a real wheeler dealer, got a lot of stuff through in the 80s. And there's an apocryphal maybe story where someone said to him, Tip, this is what we want. You really got to do this. And he turned around and said, that's a great idea. Now make me do it. And that's going to be the trick going forward to people who care about certain causes. Make them do it. And by that, I mean, write letters to your newspapers, be online talking about it, change the political conversation. And that's how you get stuff done in America, is by changing the political conversation. So a couple of things about that. So that's my take on, I am thrilled to see educated, committed, kind, intelligent, able people back in government. And one of the things that's interesting about that, and I think one of the reasons that some of the Trump people are so angry, is because one of the tricks to Trump having such loyal people around him, certainly in this D-list phase we're in now, is that those sorts of people would never be able to get jobs in a healthy administration because they're not qualified. Chad Wolf is not a qualified acting Secretary of Homeland Security. He's simply not. Look at the man that Biden has nominated instead, who's got a resume as long as your arm. Chad Wolf knows that once Trump is out of office, he's got nothing. He has no depth of knowledge, no expertise, no ability ever to reach that height again on his own. And I think that's true across the board for the Trump appointees. And that's one of the reasons they're so angry, is that once this government gets back into the hands of professionals, they couldn't get these jobs. And that's one of the hallmarks, I think, of what looks like it's going to be a healthy administration. And so I want to say one more thing about that. People are talking about different aspects of, and I'm seeing Steve Morgan. I was just about to talk about this. Different things that we would like to see happen, and what do I think is important? There are a number of things. Citizens, the overturning Citizens United, getting rid of big money in politics, getting rid of dark money in politics. Taxation is another thing I care about. But above everything, for me, and this is something that I will be working on. It's not going to surprise anybody. It's not on the table right now, but I hope by 4 years from now it will be. The fairness doctrine. I have said to people here in private messages, and I've maintained this for a long time, that I am not kidding when I say the lapse of the fairness doctrine in 1987, I think it was, possibly 6, but I think it was 7, under Ronald Reagan, once he had put his own people on the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. The lapse of the fairness doctrine that had held our political discourse to facts since the end of the 19th century was the break in the dam that has created this moment where we have significant numbers of the American population who no longer believe facts, who no longer believe reality. And with the fall of the fairness doctrine in 87, we get the rise of talk radio almost immediately, and Rush Limbaugh. That's how Rush Limbaugh gets his foot in the door. And of course, the point of a fairness doctrine was that under it, if you had a broadcast license, which at the time you did, we didn't have cable yet, so a new fairness doctrine would have to take into consideration the internet and cable as well. There is a way. People are like, oh, there's no way to do that. There is a way. I don't know what it is yet, but there is, because there's always a way. The fairness doctrine said that if you held a broadcast license, you had to stick to facts. Like, you couldn't make stuff up. And you had to present, if you were going to editorialize, you had to present the other side. So if you remember, Emily Latella always running in on Saturday Night Live screaming, I have a different opinion. And there's a scene in Archie Bunker where he gets to be the editorial opinion on a news show about why guns are a good thing. And Emily Latella, which was Gilda Radner, always got wrong what she was defending. So when people were saying that they thought euthanasia was a bad thing, she said, I'm in favor of youth in Asia. I think it's good to have young people. And, that's what they had to do under the fairness doctrine. And once the fairness doctrine was gone, you could say anything and you could do anything. And then we got talk radio. And in 1994, we get the Fox News channel, which is not news. It does have news programs. Chris Wallace is a journalist, and a good one. He's a conservative journalist. He has a conservative point of view, but he fact checks. He looks at sources. He says what's true. He says, he will say to Trump, this hasn't happened, you're lying. But the other shows, Sean Hannity and Judge Janine and what's her name with the blonde hair, which covers a lot. Anyway, they are performers, and it says so in their disclaimer. You always ask me about this every time I say this. I'm going to tell you exactly where it is. Google terms of service, Fox News, and go to the first line of the second paragraph. It's right there. This is for entertainment purposes only. And that you couldn't do that before the fairness doctrine. So I would like to see the fairness doctrine brought back, and there'd be some sort of establishment of what is fact in America, because I think all of these other problems are solvable so long as we're all operating in the real world. And remember, this is exactly how we got to this problem, was the fact that coming out of World War II, it was not possible for people who wanted to dial back the New Deal and Eisenhower's middle way to get traction, because everybody loved it. The GMP was great, and people had homes and cars and jobs, and they didn't want to get rid of the business regulation and the social safety net and the infrastructure projects that were enabling all that to happen. And the way that movement conservatives got rid of that was by getting rid of the fairness doctrine and by going ahead and saying, we're going to create a narrative that is going to get people to agree to erase the New Deal and to erase Eisenhower's middle way, to get rid of business regulation, to get rid of a social safety net, and to get rid of public projects, because that will, in our minds, return liberty to the businessmen who are the true creators of this country and take us back to the 1920s. So for me, there are many causes I care about, but that's the one where I'm going to be putting my muscle. Now, I wanted to leave you with one more thing that you did not ask about, but I'm going to be writing about it over the next week at some point, and I just think it might be interesting. And that is that I want to talk a little bit about Thanksgiving, because it's a weird one this year. We'll be writing about it in the history books, but we'll be writing about everything in the history books these days, right? And a lot of people, like, what's his name? Ted Cruz had this big thing on Twitter where he had, a turkey and come and take it, because we're all gonna, he's insisting that there is a war on Thanksgiving, because we're all sort of begging people not to go out. And Thanksgiving is my big holiday. It's the only one I really desperately care about. And I always have to throw a huge Thanksgiving, and my family and my friends, and hi, Steve, by the way, if you're out there. Former student who's always come to me, and he's not going to come this year, because it's just going to be me and Buddy, not even our kids, who are in their own bubbles, because this virus is real, and we are so sorry, but damn close to having a vaccine distributed. It's killing me that people are acting like we can all play it's like it's fine, because it's not. And anyway, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about the history of Thanksgiving and how maybe that might soften the blow a little bit for people who feel like they can't have it, or like it's going to be different, because it is going to be different. My kids are in their bubble together, and they're having ribs. They're smoking ribs because they're like, we can't do Thanksgiving. We're going to do something we can do outside, all masked up. So they're doing ribs, which is, I guess they'll tell their kids about it. Anyway, Thanksgiving, the whole turkey stuff and all that, that's made up. And there was, in fact, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags did, in fact, have a meal together in Plymouth Plantation. It was held at the end of the season, but they had venison, and they had, lobsters and whatever was to hand. And it was a marking of friendship between the two. There was a brief period in which the two sides did get along before that all fell apart, but nobody paid much attention to it. It was just one of the many things, and we know about it because it shows up in Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation, and it's kind of in passing. Thanksgiving becomes a thing in the 1840s and the 1850s when Sarah Josepha Hale, who is the woman who edits Godey's Ladies book, which you can find pictures of online, by the way. It was mostly about clothing patterns. If you've read Laura Ingalls Wilder, they always were looking for people who had the most recent ladies book. When she says ladies book, that's what she means, so that they knew what clothing was in style in New York, so they could replicate it out there in South Dakota. She edited this magazine, and she was really concerned about the rising sectionalism between the North and the South. And so she kept harping on the idea that if Americans would only reach back to their shared past and have these traditional foods, that they would not have the Civil War, that they would come together. And she kept agitating for it in her magazine, which was quite popular. And she kept trying to put together the idea of this sort of homey country Thanksgiving. And it didn't really take off. To some degree it did, but it didn't really take off. And the reason that we celebrate Thanksgiving is entirely different. Thanksgiving becomes a thing during the Civil War, because at first, at the beginning of the war, when things are going really badly for the Union, a number of ministers decide that what will help is if they recreate the fast days from the early colonial period, when there were special times of stress in American society. The Puritan ministers, not the Pilgrims, which is a different kettle of fish. Someday maybe I'll lecture on. I love the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans, but the Puritans would have a fast. They would sort of mortify themselves, if you will, fast, to ask God's forgiveness for whatever they had done, so that God would come back and be on their side. So the beginning of the war, a lot of the people in the North would have fast days where they would try and help out the troops by hoping to please God. Well, by 1862, states are beginning to have not fast days, but days of Thanksgiving for a battle, for example, that has gone well. And by 1862, Lincoln sort of realizes that he's got to get in on this whole concept of Thanksgiving as well, because he's sort of left in the dust on this one. And there's real pressure from people like Sarah Joseph Hale, but also from other states to go ahead and for him to create a national Thanksgiving. And he does. He creates a Thanksgiving in, I believe it's July of 1863, to go ahead and to thank God for the fact that the Union troops are winning. But the real formal origin of a national Thanksgiving is actually randomly in I believe it's August of that year. It's not going to be November till FDR. August of that year, when Lincoln actually writes a Thanksgiving proclamation. And in that Thanksgiving proclamation, he has nothing to do with food at all. And what it has to do with is the country. And what he says is that we have to give thanks in that year when things had gone well for the Union, that God had so favored the United States, which is, after all, what Lincoln represents, that the country had not split apart, and that the economy had not crashed in the middle of a war. This is an era when they didn't understand deficit spending, so they didn't really understand why things were going as well as they were in the North, but go well they were. And that for all the fact that there had been this terrible slaughter on the battlefields, the United States government was still on good terms with foreign countries, and it still was intact, and its people still supported it, and it looked as if it was going to weather this terrible storm intact. And for that, all Americans, he said, should be thankful. Now that's going to get changed the timing of it is going to be changed in the 1930s under FDR, and then of course in the 1950s it's going to take on all the connotations of gathering together families, and then people are going to rediscover these elaborate menus that Sarah Joseph Hale suggested. And then once we get the foodie craze beginning in the 1970s, most of you think it's always been here. It has not. Some of us grew up on canned green beans. That once the foodie craze took off in the 1970s, the whole Thanksgiving, fancy meals, lots of people, all that really took off. But if you want to get back to what Thanksgiving really was about, it was about thanking God that this country had survived a terrible crisis. And that seems like we can all manage this year. Thanks for being here. And I will be back next Tuesday at least. I haven't decided about Thursday. Let me know what you think. It is Thanksgiving. But like I say, I'm here. No family, no nothing this year. So let me know if you think you would like to hear something from me on Thursday. Otherwise, I'll at least be back next Tuesday. And I will post on my Facebook page whether or not I am going to be here Thursday, so you don't have to guess. And have a great one, people. And thanks for being here. And I'll see you back here next Tuesday.